And I'm welcoming everybody for our second round of the Virtual Roundtable on Demand. The Virtual Roundtable on Demand is basically the concept that teachers can request a great author, a great teacher, or a great guest speaker. And they do this, we actually don't know whom they request. Obviously, that's on demand. So we have had the request from Mexico for Scott Thornbury, and Scott Thornbury is a well-known author who's published a series of books on grammar, on English language, TEFL learning. Himself is from New Zealand, native New Zealand, but he studied his Master of TEFL in Reading in Berkshire in England, and he also taught this in Egypt, in the UK, and in Spain, and he currently lives in Spain. And he currently is also associate professor for an MA TESOL program in New York. And I'm welcoming Scott Thornbury very much. We've had a number of questions for him, so I'm going to pass over to the people who have asked this question, and I'm passing over to Orlando and Karen. First of all, I think it's Orlando himself who voiced the question. Orlando, would you mind saying the question again, or would you like Scott to read the question for you that you posted on the wiki? No, actually, Scott thought it would be better to start with your question. Okay.
Hi, Orlando.
Hi. Well, basically, my question is related to your approach that I actually experimented when I was in my Delta back in December. And well, I guess you've already read my question. Quite soon I'm going to become a CELTA and an ICELT trainer. So I was just wondering the extent to which DOGME could actually be taught, or could actually be part of the syllabus or the curriculum on certain formal teacher training courses, such as the CELTA itself or the ICELT, for example.
Okay, let me answer that and just sketch in briefly for those of you who might not be familiar with DOGME. And then Karen, I'll ask me a question perhaps related to the same topic. I mean, very, very quickly, the DOGME movement was not a movement at all. It was an idea that Danica about nearly 10 years ago, when I was teacher training on the kind of courses, Orlando, that you were doing and will be teaching, like the Delta course, for example. And one of the things that my colleagues and I were noticing about the trainees was their massive dependence that they were filling up every corner of their lesson with technology, books, handouts, whatever. And I found an interesting analogy with the DOGME film movement, and which was started in 1995, I think, by a group of filmmakers in Denmark, hence the name DOGME, who turned their back on big budget Hollywood kind of movie, decided that they wanted to mount a kind of what they called a rescue action and restore filmmaking to its simpler, less technology dependent origins. And I thought this analogy carried over to our field, which I felt had become inundated or even dependent, overly dependent on imported materials, imported in every sense of the word, imported from other countries, imported into the classroom. So I wrote an article to that effect, which seemed to tap into a feeling that was shared by a number of people around the world, and we started a discussion list on the internet, which has its ironies, of course, because there we are using a technology, as we are at this very moment, to broadcast a kind of what was seen to be an anti-kind of technology or Luddite kind of philosophy. Nevertheless, what's been interesting about it is over the years how it's evolved and become much less a kind of anti-technology, anti-materials, and more pro-learner. And I think that's the point that, coming back to your question, Orlando, I think there is a place on conventional training courses for a kind of DOGME approach. And it relates a little bit to your, earlier in your question that you posted on the wiki, you said that when you started teaching, you used to plan and prepare your classes very carefully. You followed your lesson plans to the letter, and it was only later when you were doing your Delta course that you started to free up a little bit, and as you experimented with the DOGME approach. And I find that a very interesting statement, because I think that reflects a trajectory that many teachers go through when they start teaching. They have to plan every last second of their lessons, and they do tend to plan it around using a lot of materials. The sense of going in unprepared is both threatens their credibility as a professional, but also it's a way of reinforcing them against the unexpected. As we become more experienced as teachers and we learn how to handle the unexpected and even how to exploit the unexpected, we have to plan less. And there seems to be a kind of inverse proportion between the sooner you start teaching, you plan a lot, and then as you develop management skills, the management takes over and the planning becomes less. And I have no issue with that. The problem is, I think, when the management becomes entirely the management of materials or the management of technology and not the management of learning. And this concept of learning management is one that's I'm fascinated by. I'm reading, in fact, I've got it right here. I'm reading a book that is co-written by Dick Allwright, the developing language learner. He's looking at, and he's the one who coined this expression, the management of learning, and has written extensively on this dichotomy between, on the one hand, the kind of what he calls the teaching point mentality, where teachers just teach points, as opposed to managing learning opportunities, where the teacher uses what's going on and builds on its own productions to create learning opportunities. And this seems to me a very potent idea, and it's really, in a sense, it's taken over for me from the sort of original conception of DOGME, which, as I said, was more anti-materials than pro-learning. And I think there's been a movement in that direction. So this is a long way around answering your question, but I would say yes, definitely. As a teacher trainer, you should, even at pre-service level, I think, look at ways of using the training environment to encourage teachers to take an interest in their learners and how they are learning and what it takes to learn a language, a second language. And it doesn't take a succession of grammar points, is what I think is fundamentally my argument. I'll come back to that shortly, because there's another question about grammar coming up. Does that make any sense to you, Orlando, before I hand over to...
Oh, yeah, definitely. It actually makes tons of sense, definitely, yes.